The air at the Abernathy estate auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of stirred-up dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the faint, sad smell of a life packed into cardboard boxes. It was July of 1971, and the sun beat down on Miller County with a vengeance, baking the cracked earth of the farmyard into a pale, lifeless grey. I stood near the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, watching the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Billis, work his magic on the gathered farmers. They were a flock of crows in seed corn caps, picking over the bones of old man Abernathy's 90 years on this planet. My name is Jedediah Stone, but folks just call me Jed. I was 24 then, with a farmer's tan already etched deep into my neck and arms. I'd been running our family's 240 acres solo for 3 years, ever since my father's heart had given out in the middle of spring planting. He'd left me the land, the house, a barn full of aging but reliable equipment, and one piece of advice hammered into my skull since I was old enough to hold a wrench. Debt is a yoke, son. It'll plow you under faster than any drought. I lived by those words. My main tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a diesel powerhouse my dad had bought new, paying cash from 3 straight years of bumper crops. It was my pride and joy. I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every whine and groan of its 6-cylinder engine. It was honest iron. It was paid for. That's why I stood out like a sore thumb in the changing landscape of American agriculture. Men like Earl Thompson were the new kings. Earl was leaning against the fender of his brand-new International Harvester, 1066, a gleaming red beast with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a stereo. He'd driven it to the auction like a man driving a Cadillac to a church social. He was all smiles and back slaps, his gut straining the buttons of his pearl-snap shirt. He was farming close to 1,000 acres, all of it leveraged with bank money. He saw debt not as a yoke, but as a tool, a modern necessity for getting big. And in the early 70s, with grain prices starting to climb, everyone thought he was a genius. "Look at this junk," Earl boomed to the men gathered around him, gesturing with his cigar at the line of Abernathy's decrepit machinery. Man hadn't bought a new piece of equipment since Truman was in office. They all laughed. I kept my eyes on the prize, the last item in the row. It was a Farmall M, probably a 1949 or 50 model. It was a pathetic sight. The red paint was faded to a dull, chalky pink, flaking off in sheets to reveal continents of rust. The rear tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the soft dirt. A tangle of baling wire held one of the headlamps in place, and a thick layer of greasy grime covered the engine block like a shroud. A handwritten sign on the radiator read, "Engine seized, as is." To everyone else, it was a 2-ton paperweight, scrap iron waiting for the cutting torch. But I saw something else. I saw the straight lines of the frame, the uncracked casting of the transmission housing. I saw potential. I needed a smaller tractor for cultivating and running the auger, something more fuel efficient than the big 4020. The M, if I could get it running, was perfect. Billis the auctioneer finally arrived at the end of the line. "All right, boys, last lot of the day. What we have here is a genuine piece of agricultural history, a classic Farmall M. She ain't pretty, and the ticker's stopped, but there's good steel here. Who'll give me $50 to start? $50 for this classic piece of iron." Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet. A hot breeze rustled the dry corn leaves in the adjacent field. $50. You'll spend more on a night out with the missus. Who'll give me 50? Earl Thompson let out a loud, theatrical laugh. $50 for a boat anchor, Billis. I'll give you 5 for scrap value. More laughter. My face grew hot. I hated being the center of attention, but I hated seeing a good piece of iron insulted even more. My father had taught me to respect the machines that put food on the table, even the old ones. "I'll give you 25, I said, my voice coming out clearer and louder than I'd intended. Every head turned to look at me. Earl's smirk widened. "Well, look what we got here. Jed Stone, the museum curator. What are you going to do with that thing, Jed? Put it on a pedestal in your front yard?" "I'm going to get it running," I said, looking straight at Billis, ignoring Earl. "Got 25 from the young man. Who'll give me 30? $30? Billis pleaded, scanning the crowd. No one moved. 30, a voice grumbled. It was one of Earl's buddies, goaded into it by a nudge from Earl himself. 35, I shot back immediately. 40, came the reply. They were toying with me now, driving up the price for their own amusement. I could feel their eyes on me, judging my patched jeans, my sweat-stained hat, my stubborn refusal to join their new world of easy credit and shiny paint. 50, I said, my jaw tight. That was my limit. It was 2 days' worth of wages for a hired hand, a significant amount of cash for me. Billis's head snapped back and forth between me and Earl's crony. "I got 50 from Mr. Stone. Do I hear 55? 55? Earl shook his head at his friend, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let the boy have his toy." The man shrugged. $50 once, $50 twice. Sold for $50 to Jed Stone. Billis banged his imaginary gavel on his clipboard. "Son, you just bought yourself a project." The crowd began to disperse, the low murmur of their conversations punctuated by Earl's booming voice. "Can you believe that? $50 for a pile of rust. Some people just don't know when to quit living in the past." I paid the clerk my $50, the $5 $10 bills feeling crisp and hard-earned in my hand. It took another 10 to get old man Hemlock to agree to haul the tractor back to my place on his flatbed trailer. As we worked to winch the dead machine onto the trailer, its seized wheels dragging deep furrows in the dirt, I could feel Earl Thompson's gaze on my back, heavy with pity and condescension. He didn't know the first thing about me, or about the lessons my father had taught me. He saw an old tractor. I saw independence. Back in the cool, cavernous quiet of my barn, the Farmall looked even more forlorn. The air smelled of hay, old oil, and damp earth. My 40-20 sat in its usual spot, looking like a giant green guardian next to this rusty little orphan. I spent the rest of the afternoon just walking around the M, my hand trailing over the cold, pitted metal. I checked the oil. It was a thick, black sludge. I pulled a spark plug. It was fouled and corroded. I put a long breaker bar on the crankshaft pulley nut and leaned into it with all my weight. It didn't budge, not a millimeter. That engine was seized up tighter than a banker's fist. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the service manual I'd found for the M in a dusty box at the co-op. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the diagrams simple and clean. I started making a list. Gasket set, piston rings, plugs, wires. I'd have to pull the head, no two ways about it. If the cylinder walls were scored too badly, it was a lost cause. But if they were salvageable, I had a chance. For the next week, I soaked the engine. I pulled the remaining plugs and poured a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and diesel fuel into each cylinder, hoping the concoction would creep down past the piston rings and break the bond of rust. Every morning before chores and every evening after, I'd put the breaker bar on that crank nut and heave, hoping to feel that magical, minuscule give that meant freedom. Nothing. The community didn't forget my little purchase. When I went into town for supplies, I'd get the questions. "Hey Jed, how's that new tractor running?" followed by a snicker. Earl drove by my place one afternoon, slowing his new Ford pickup to a crawl, and just shook his head as he saw me wrestling with the breaker bar. He thought I was a fool, wasting time and energy on a ghost. Now, before I tell you what I found when I finally pulled that cylinder head, I want to ask you something. Have you ever taken a chance on something everyone else called junk? A rusty old tool? A beat-up car? A piece of equipment left for dead? Drop a comment below and tell me about the hidden treasure you uncovered. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your story. After a week of soaking and pulling, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to open her up. I spent a Saturday morning carefully disconnecting the fuel line, the throttle linkage, and the radiator hoses, which were as hard and brittle as old plastic. The manifold bolts were a nightmare, each one a battle of penetrating oil, heat from my acetylene torch, and sheer knuckle-busting torque. Finally, around noon, I got to the head bolts. They were massive, sunk deep into the cast iron. Using a 3/4-inch drive socket and a 4-foot cheetah pipe, I broke them loose one by one, the sound echoing through the barn like a gunshot. With the last bolt out, I threaded in a couple of guide studs and attached my engine hoist. I gently took up the tension. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening, scraping sound of rust breaking free, the head lifted from the block. I swung it over and lowered it onto a wooden pallet. And then I looked down into the heart of the machine. My breath caught in my throat. The cylinders were, as expected, a mess of rust and black sludge. But it was the pistons themselves that made me stop. They weren't the flat-topped, cast-iron pistons that should have been in a stock Farmall M. These were different. They had a strange, raised, volcano-like shape in the center, a design I'd only ever seen in old, aftermarket tractor-pulling catalogues. They were high-compression pistons, fire crater pistons they called them. They were designed to squeeze every last ounce of power out of the fuel. That was just the start. I wiped away some of the grime from the top of the cylinder sleeves. A standard M had a 3 and 7 to 8 inch bore. I laid my calipers across the opening. My eyes widened. It was over 4 inches. This wasn't just a high-compression kit. Old man Abernathy had bored the block out, fitted it with oversized sleeves and pistons. He'd built a hot rod. The next few weeks were a blur of meticulous work. I rigged a ridge reamer and carefully shaved the top of the cylinders. Then, using a ball hone on my electric drill, I spent hours honing the cylinder walls, the rhythmic zip-zip of the stones echoing in the barn as I worked to restore a clean, cross-hatched pattern to the metal. The walls weren't scored. The rust was just on the surface. It was salvageable. I pulled the oil pan, a messy job that left me coated in black slime from elbow to shoulder. I unbolted the connecting rod caps and carefully pushed the pistons out through the top of the block. They were heavy, solid things, custom-made by the looks of it. There were no markings I recognized. I cleaned them in a tub of gasoline until they shone, marveling at the craftsmanship. The crankshaft was the real test. If it was damaged, the whole project was sunk. I cleaned the journals and measured them with my micrometer. They were still within tolerance. I laid strips of plasticage on them, torqued down the main caps, then removed them to check the clearance. It was perfect. Old man Abernathy had been a hell of a mechanic. The reason the engine had seized wasn't from a catastrophic failure. Based on the amount of water and rust in the number 3 cylinder, I figured he'd left it sitting outside with a bad manifold gasket or a cracked plug, and rain had gotten in. It was a slow, quiet death, not a violent one. I ordered a new gasket set from the Napa in town, along with rings, bearings, and ignition parts. The kid behind the counter, who drove a souped-up Camaro, gave me a funny look. "Man, these part numbers are ancient. You rebuilding a museum piece?" "Something like that," I said with a smile. The reassembly was like a sacred ritual. I checked and double-checked every torque spec in the old manual. I used assembly lube on the bearings, oiled the rings before compressing them into the cylinders, and set the valve lash with a feeler gauge until it was just right. Each part, cleaned and restored, went back into place. The greasy, rusted hulk was slowly transforming back into a machine. The day it was all back together, I felt a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I'd rebuilt the carburetor, cleaned the sediment bowl, and put a new 6-volt battery in the box. I filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30-weight oil. I rolled the big 4020 out of the barn to give myself room, just in case. I climbed onto the steel pan seat, the metal cold against my jeans. I pulled the choke, turned the key, and hit the starter button. The starter groaned, turning the newly freed engine over slowly, painfully. Chug, chug, chug. It fought me, tight and unfamiliar. I kept my thumb on the button. Chug, chug. Whoom, a puff of black smoke shot out of the straight pipe exhaust, followed by a cough and a sputter. Chug. Whoom. Pop, pop, bang. It backfired, a cannon shot that sent a flock of pigeons scattering from the barn rafters. I kept at it. And then it happened. The sputtering caught, the rhythm smoothed out, and the engine roared to life. But the sound, it wasn't the familiar, gentle pop, pop, pop of a Farmall M. This was something else, entirely. It was a deep, throaty, menacing roar. It had a lope to it, a rhythmic, muscular cadence that spoke of a bigger camshaft and higher compression. It shook the concrete floor of the barn. I let it warm up, then eased the throttle forward. The roar deepened, a sound full of power and torque that an old M had no business making. This wasn't just a tractor. It was Abernathy's secret. A sleeper. A small tractor with the heart of a giant. And it was mine. All mine, for $50 and a summer's worth of sweat. The fortune wasn't gold bars hidden in the engine block. It was horsepower. Raw, usable, debt-free horsepower. The next few years proved the value of that discovery. The early 70s were good to farmers. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the US wheat crop. They called it the Great Grain Robbery on the news. But for us, it meant one thing. Prices shot through the roof. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans went from $3 to nearly $10. All of a sudden, there was money to be made. Real money, and that's when the madness started. The banks, flush with cash, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. Land prices doubled, then tripled. A new arms race began, not with tanks and missiles, but with tractors and combines. Earl Thompson was the 5-star general of this new army. He leveraged everything he had, and then some. He bought the 160 acres to the east of me, paying a price per acre that made my father's generation gasp. Then he bought the Abernathy place, another 80. He tore down the old farmhouse and put up a massive new machine shed, the kind with fluorescent lights and a concrete floor so smooth you could eat off it. His old 1066 was traded in for a brand new International 1466, and then he added the crown jewel, a massive articulated Steiger 444, a green monster that could pull a 12-bottom plow and work around the clock. He bought a new Gleaner combine with a heated cab and a grain monitor. He put up 2 new grain bins with electric dryers, their silver sides gleaming in the sun like monuments to his success. He and his wife started driving a new Lincoln Town car into town. He was the president of the co-op board, the man everyone looked to for advice. And his advice was always the same. Get big or get out. You got to spend money to make money. He'd see me out in the field on my old 40-20, or cultivating with the souped-up M, and he'd slow his pickup on the road and just watch me for a minute, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Jed, my boy," he said to me one day at the feed mill, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, "I don't know how you do it, scrimping and saving with that old junk. The bank's offering money at 7%. You could trade that whole fleet of yours in, get yourself a new 100-horse tractor, maybe pick up that old Miller farm before a developer gets it. You're letting the best times farming has ever seen pass you right by." "I'm doing all right, Earl," I'd say. "Equipment's paid for. Land's paid for. I sleep pretty good at night." "Sleep don't pay the bills," he'd laugh, and walk away shaking his head. The truth was, I was doing more than all right. The high prices meant that even with my smaller acreage, I was making good money. But instead of buying new iron, I paid off the last of the operating loan my father had taken out before he died. I'll never forget the day I walked into the bank and handed the check to the loan officer. He looked at me like I had 3 heads. "Jed, you're paying this off? Now? Everyone else is borrowing. We could extend you a line of credit for $250,000 just on your signature." "No, thank you," I said. "I just want the note." I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. I was 27 years old, and I didn't owe a single person on this earth a single red cent. My land, my house, my machines, they were all mine. To the rest of the county, I looked like I was falling behind, a relic of a bygone era. I was the cautionary tale mothers told their ambitious sons. Don't be like Jed Stone, afraid to take a chance. My girlfriend, Sarah, whose father farmed 800 acres with a full line of brand new green paint, started getting pressure from her family. They saw me as a dead end. I didn't care. I put a new roof on the barn. I rebuilt the engine on the 40-20, not because it needed it, but because I wanted it to be perfect. And I used the M. That little tractor was my secret weapon. With its oversized engine, it could pull a 4-bottom plow in our heavy clay soil, something a stock M could never dream of doing. It sipped fuel compared to the big tractors, and because it was lighter, it didn't compact the soil as much. While Earl was making massive payments on his fleet of giant machines, my only costs were fuel, oil, and the occasional part. I was saving my money, putting it in certificates of deposit at the bank, building a war chest for a storm I wasn't sure was coming, but which my father's stories of the 30s had taught me to always expect. The boom rolled on through the mid-70s. Inflation, a word we only heard on the national news, started creeping into our lives. The price of fuel went up, fertilizer costs doubled. The interest rates on those bank CDs started ticking up, from 5% to 6%, then to 8%. On the radio, a man named Paul Volcker was appointed to run the Federal Reserve, and he started talking tough about whipping inflation, no matter the cost. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was standing on my porch as the sun went down, casting long shadows across the harvested corn stubble. The air was crisp and carried the smell of wood smoke. Across the road, Earl's farm was lit up like a small city. The lights on his new machine shed blazed. The fans on his grain dryers whirred loudly, running day and night. I could see the headlights of his big Steiger still moving in a distant field, trying to get the last of his soybeans in before the rain. It looked impressive. It looked like the future. But I'd been at the co-op that afternoon and overheard 2 of the older farmers talking in hushed tones. They were talking about Earl, about the massive operating loan he'd taken out that spring when interest rates were 9%. They were talking about how the new loans for equipment were at 12%, and they were talking about how the price of corn had started to slip. A cold wind kicked up from the northwest, rattling the last few dry leaves on the big oak tree in my yard. I looked up at the sky. Dark, heavy clouds were massing on the horizon, blotting out the stars. A storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones, and I had a sinking feeling it was going to be a bad one. The first tremor hit in January of 1980. I was listening to the radio in the barn, my hands deep in the guts of a corn planter I was rebuilding, when the news came on. President Carter was announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union because of their invasion of Afghanistan. The announcer's voice was grave, but I didn't need him to tell me what it meant. The biggest customer we had was gone overnight. The price of corn, which had been hovering around $3, fell 50 cents in a single day. At the co-op, the mood turned sour. The men who had been talking about buying new pickups a month before were now hunched over their coffee, staring into the black liquid as if it held the answers. Earl Thompson laughed it off. "A political stunt," he boomed, holding court by the feed sacks. "It'll blow over in 6 months. The world's got to eat. Prices will come back stronger than ever. A smart man buys when there's blood in the streets." He went out and bought another 120 acres that spring, taking on another variable rate loan from the bank in Miller City. The interest rate was 14%, but the prices didn't come back. They stayed low, stagnant, while the cost of everything else kept climbing. Diesel fuel hit $1 a gallon, then $1.25. A bag of seed corn that cost $40 in 1978 was now $65. The numbers just weren't adding up. You could feel the anxiety spreading through the county like a blight, slow and silent. Then the sky turned against us. The spring of 1983 was dry. The summer was brutal. The sun came up each morning, not as a friendly, life-giving orb, but as a white-hot enemy. Day after day, it beat down from a cloudless, metallic sky. The corn in my fields grew to be about waist-high, and then just stopped, the leaves curling up into tight, grey-green needles to protect themselves from the heat. The tassels that emerged were brown and sterile. The ground cracked open in patterns that looked like a dry riverbed, the fissures deep enough to swallow a wrench. My old 4820, with its open station, was an oven. The heat radiated up from the engine and transmission housing, and the sun beat down on my head. But it ran. It never missed a beat. The Farmall M, light on its feet, was perfect for cultivating the soybeans, trying to keep the weeds from stealing what little moisture there was. I worked at night when I could, under the cold, distant light of the moon, just to escape the hell of the daytime heat. One afternoon in late July, I saw Earl's big Steiger stopped dead in the middle of the field across the road. It was a massive, articulated beast, the kind of tractor that looked like it could pull the world. But it wasn't moving. I saw Earl get out of the air-conditioned cab, his face red with anger, and kick one of the giant 8-foot-tall tires. A little while later, the service truck from the dealership in the next county arrived. I saw the mechanic, a young kid named Danny, at the diner a few days later. He looked exhausted. "What happened with Earl's Steiger?" I asked, sliding into the booth across from him. He took a long drink of his iced tea. "Hydraulics," he said, shaking his head. A main pump in the transmission went out. Took a whole planetary gear set with it. "You know what the parts alone for that job cost?" I shook my head. $12,000, he said, his voice a whisper. "And that's before labor. We had to split the tractor in half right there in the field. It's a nightmare of wiring harnesses and solenoid valves. Give me a simple old gear jammer like your 4020 any day of the week. $12,000. That was more than I'd cleared in the last 2 years combined. I heard later that Earl had to take out another loan just to cover the repair bill. He got the tractor running again, but the stress was starting to show. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, tight-lipped scowl. His booming laugh no longer echoed around the co-op. He'd stalk in, grab what he needed, and leave without talking to anyone. The pearl-snap shirts were stained with sweat and grease now, and his eyes had the haunted look of a man who lies awake at night, listening to the sound of his own heart and the relentless ticking of a clock. The cracks in the empire were starting to show, deep and dark, like the fissures in the parched earth. The fall of 1984 was when the floor fell out. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war against inflation, had jacked up the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. 21%. The number itself felt like a physical blow. For men like me, with no debt, it was an abstract horror story on the evening news. For men like Earl Thompson, whose entire operation was built on a mountain of variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His payments, which had been manageable at 7 or 9%, suddenly doubled, then tripled. It was like trying to outrun a locomotive. At the same time, land values, which had been the collateral for all that borrowing, collapsed. The $250,000 farm was suddenly worth $80,000, and the bank was demanding more collateral that simply didn't exist. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, small print in the legal section at first, then spreading like a disease. The Smith place, the Jensen farm. Families who had worked that land for 100 years were being served with eviction papers. Farm auctions became weekly events, but they weren't the neighborly estate sales of the past. They were grim, silent affairs, conducted by stone-faced bank representatives. Sheriff's deputies stood by just in case. The crowds were thin, made up of other desperate farmers hoping to pick up a cheap part, and vultures from the city looking to buy land for pennies on the dollar. I went to one. I had to see it for myself. A man I'd known my whole life, a good man named Charlie Miller, stood on his own porch with his wife, their faces pale and empty, as an auctioneer sold off every piece of their lives, their wedding china, their children's bicycles, and then the machinery. A John Deere 4440, bought new just 5 years earlier for $60,000, sold for $12,000. It was a slaughter. I left before they sold the land. I couldn't watch. I survived by living small. The drought had ruined my corn crop, but the soybeans had made it, stunted but sellable. I didn't make much, but my costs were low. When the water pump on the 4020 went out, I rebuilt it myself on the workbench for the price of a gasket and a bearing. When the M needed a new clutch, I split the tractor myself in the barn, using the service manual and a set of chain hoists. I had a big garden, and Sarah, who had come back after her own father nearly lost his farm, canned enough vegetables to last us through the winter. We had chickens for eggs and a couple of milk cows. We weren't getting rich, but we were eating. We were holding on. Earl Thompson couldn't hold on. His day of reckoning came in the spring of 1985. The notice in the paper was stark. Public auction, by order of Miller City Savings and Loan, the property of Earl and Martha Thompson. Weinerwald at 400 acres, full line of late-model farm machinery, and household goods. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a miserable March day, with a wind that cut to the bone. The whole county was there, it seemed. Not out of spite, but out of a kind of morbid curiosity, like watching a great oak tree finally fall. The shiny machines were lined up in the massive yard Earl had been so proud of. The Steiger, the Gleaner combine, the rows of red International tractors. They looked like museum pieces already, monuments to a forgotten age of optimism. Earl wasn't there at first. His wife, Martha, sat alone in their Lincoln Town car, which had a repossession notice tucked under the windshield wiper. She just stared straight ahead, her face a mask of grief. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools from the shop. They went for nothing. A $1,000 snap-on toolbox sold for $75. Then he moved to the big iron. The prices were insulting. The giant Steiger, with its brand new transmission, sold for less than what Earl had paid for the repair. The Gleaner Combine, a $250,000 machine, was bought by a big corporate farm from out of state for $30,000. I stood at the back, my hands in my pockets, just watching. I felt no joy, no sense of vindication. All I felt was a profound sadness. Earl had been arrogant, he'd been condescending, but he was a farmer. He loved the land in his own way. He was just a man who had believed the gospel of the bankers and the experts, and it had led him to ruin. Just as the auctioneer was about to start on the land, Earl appeared. He walked out of the machine shed, looking like a ghost. He was thin, his clothes hung on him, and his face was a roadmap of sleepless nights. He walked right up to the auctioneer's truck and stood there, watching them sell his life away, parcel by parcel. He had to bear witness. I had come with a purpose. For years I had been putting my meager profits into those high-interest certificates of deposit. I wasn't rich, but I had cash, and in 1985, cash was king. When the auctioneer got to the last parcel, the original 80-acre Abernathy place, the one with the old barn and farmhouse, I stepped forward. The bidding started low. A developer from the city who wanted to subdivide it into 5-acre hobby farms was the main bidder. He was smug, confident. The bidding crept up to $20,000. 25. The developer bid 30. 35,000, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. The auctioneer looked at me, surprised. The developer glared. He bid 36. 40, I said immediately. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing. The crowd grew silent, watching this strange duel. When the bidding hit $50,000, the developer hesitated. He looked at the cracked old farmhouse, the sway-backed barn. It wasn't worth more than that to him. He shook his head and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, pointing at me. "For $50,000 to Jed Stone." A murmur went through the crowd. I walked to the clerk's table and wrote out a check from my savings account, my hand shaking slightly as I signed my name. I had just spent almost every penny I had in the world, but I had bought back the place where my own story had started, the place where that old Farmall M had sat waiting for me. After the auction was over and the crowd had drifted away, leaving behind a yard full of tire tracks and despair, I saw Earl. He was standing by the empty spot where his Steiger had been parked, just staring at the muddy ground. I walked over to him. He didn't look up. "I'm sorry, Earl," I said quietly. He finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Sorry for what?" he rasped. "For being right? You tried to tell me. Your old man tried to tell everyone. Debt's a yoke." He was right. I ploughed myself under. He let out a dry, rattling sob. "They took it all, Jed. Everything. Martha and I. We have to be out by the end of the month. We have nowhere to go." I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I could have walked away. I could have savoured the victory. But looking at this broken man, all I saw was a neighbour. "I bought the old Abernathy place," I said. He looked at me, his expression confused. "Why?" "That old house is falling down." "The house can be fixed," I said. "The land is good, and it needs a farmer. I've got my own 240 acres to run. I can't handle another 80 by myself. I need a good tenant, someone who knows that ground." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as the meaning of my words sank in. He didn't understand. You want me to rent from you?" "I want you and Martha to live in the house," I said. "No rent on the house. You can fix it up as you go. We'll work the land on shares. 60-40. You're 60. You're a better farmer than I'll ever be, Earl. You just got caught in the storm." Tears welled up in his eyes and streamed down his weathered cheeks. He didn't try to wipe them away. The proud, arrogant man I had known was gone, replaced by someone humbled, someone grateful. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, his shoulders shaking. I put a hand on his shoulder, the same way he'd once clapped me on the back to mock me. This time, it was a gesture of support. We stood there for a long time as the cold March twilight settled over the empty farmyard. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. Earl and I became partners. He brought his immense knowledge of farming, and I brought my cautious, debt-free approach. We fixed up the old Abernathy house, and Martha planted a garden that was the envy of the county. The laughter slowly returned to Earl's voice. He never got big again, but he found a different kind of wealth, a quiet contentment he'd never known when he was king of the county. The community changed. The farmers who survived the crisis were a different breed. They were tough, resilient, and deeply skeptical of easy credit. They started fixing their old machinery instead of trading it in. They helped each other, bartering work, sharing equipment, knowing that their neighbor's survival was tied to their own. My farm became a sort of hub. Men would stop by with a broken part from an old tractor, and I'd help them weld it or machine a new bushing on my lathe. They didn't look at me with pity anymore. They looked at me with respect. I was no longer Jed Stone, the museum curator. I was Jed Stone, the man who had weathered the storm. I married Sarah a couple of years later. We had a son and then a daughter. I bought another 100 acres next to mine when it came up for sale, paying cash from the slow, steady profits we were making. My farm grew, but it grew organically, at a pace I could afford, a pace the land could sustain. One warm summer evening, when my son Daniel was about 10 years old, I found him in the barn. He was standing in front of the old Farmall M, which I still used for raking hay and running the grain auger. Its red paint was faded and chipped, but the engine was as strong as ever. Daniel was running his hand over the fender, the same way I had all those years ago. "Dad," he asked, "how come we still use this old tractor when Mr. Thompson says you could afford a new one?" I smiled and walked over, wiping the grease from my hands with a red rag. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Because this tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned," I said. I pointed to the engine, the simple, honest block of cast iron that old man Abernathy had secretly given so much heart. "There's a difference between being rich and being wealthy," I told him. "Rich is having a brand new tractor with a big loan payment. Wealthy is having an old tractor that's all yours. Rich is about what you have. Wealthy is about what you don't owe." I knelt down beside him and looked into his eyes. "Debt is a yoke, son," I said, the words of my father echoing across the decades. "It'll plow you under faster than any drought. But if you own your land, and you own your iron, and you owe nothing to any man, then you're free." He looked from the old tractor to me, a flicker of understanding in his young eyes. The fortune I had found inside that rusty engine wasn't just horsepower. It was a philosophy, It was independence. It was a legacy of sweat and steel, of caution and wisdom, passed down through the generations. And as the sun set, casting long golden rays through the open barn doors and glinting off the faded paint of the old Farmall, I knew it was a legacy that would endure.